My name is Samantha Hayes, and I'm 26 years old. Standing in my parents' decorated living room on Christmas Eve, clutching an expensive bottle of wine like armor, I watched my sister Victoria arrange her annual performance. She was whispering to our cousins again, that familiar smirk spreading across her face as her eyes found mine. Poor Samantha's little boyfriend, I heard her say, loud enough for me to catch every poisonous word. The Christmas lights twinkled mockingly above us as Victoria prepared to destroy me once more. Then Daniel walked through the front door with this mysterious, confident smile that made my heart skip, and I realized Victoria had no idea what was coming for her. Before we dive into this explosive family drama, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because you won't believe how this Christmas dinner ends. Trust me, what happens next will leave you questioning everything you think you know about family loyalty. Now, let's get into how one dinner conversation completely destroyed my sister's carefully constructed life. The Hayes family Christmas had always been Victoria's stage, and tonight was no different. My older sister, 29 years old and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged, moved through our parents' house like she owned it. In many ways, she did. Victoria was the golden child, the successful real estate agent with the wealthy husband Brad, the one who never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how much better her life was than mine. She wore her success like expensive perfume, overwhelming everyone around her with the scent of her superiority. Our family had gathered in the familiar patterns that had formed over decades. Grandma Helen sat in her usual spot by the fireplace, Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol flanked the sectional sofa, and my cousins Miranda and James had claimed their territories near the kitchen island. The house smelled like pine needles and my mother's famous sugar cookies, but underneath it all was the familiar tension that came whenever Victoria and I occupied the same space. Our parents, bless their hearts, had perfected the art of willful blindness when it came to Victoria's behavior. They saw what they wanted to see, a successful daughter who visited regularly and never forgot their birthdays. Victoria had spent the afternoon orchestrating the evening like a general preparing for battle. She'd rearranged the seating in the dining room 3 times, each adjustment designed to place me further from the center of conversation. She'd positioned herself at what she considered the head of the table, despite the fact that this was our parents' house, and made sure her latest achievements were strategically displayed throughout the room. Her recent real estate award sat prominently on the mantel, her business cards were scattered across the coffee table, and she'd even brought a bottle of champagne to celebrate her latest commission. When she finally addressed me directly, it was with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Samantha," she said, her voice carrying across the room like she was addressing a crowd, "how's that little marketing job treating you? Still struggling to make ends meet?" The conversation in the room didn't stop exactly, but it shifted. Everyone's attention suddenly focused on my response. Victoria had this talent for making private failures public entertainment, and she'd been perfecting it for years. I felt my cheeks burn as I mumbled something about enjoying my work at the non-profit organization, where I coordinated community outreach programs. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't pay what Victoria made in a single real estate transaction, but it mattered to me. Victoria nodded with exaggerated sympathy, the kind reserved for wounded animals. "That's sweet," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But you know, Sam, you really should think about your future. These little passion projects are fine when you're young, but you're 26 now. Time to get serious about building real wealth." The room grew uncomfortable, family members finding sudden interest in their drinks or phones. Grandma Helen cleared her throat and tried to change the subject to the weather, but Victoria wasn't finished with her performance. She launched into a detailed account of her latest property sale, a $3 million mansion in the hills that had netted her a commission larger than my annual salary. She threw around numbers like weapons, each figure designed to highlight the growing gap between our lives. That's when Daniel arrived, and everything in the room shifted. He walked through the front door carrying a small gift bag and wearing this calm, confident expression that I'd never seen before. Usually, family gatherings made him slightly nervous, but tonight he seemed almost amused by something. Victoria's eyes immediately locked onto him like a predator spotting prey. She'd been gunning for Daniel since we'd started dating 8 months ago, convinced that he wasn't good enough for the Hayes family standards, even though those standards apparently didn't apply to her own behavior. "Daniel," Victoria called out before he'd even removed his coat, "how nice of you to join us." "I was just telling everyone about real success stories." "What was it you said you do again?" "Some kind of consulting." Her tone made it sound like he'd claimed to be a professional fortune teller. Daniel smiled politely and explained that he worked as a business consultant, helping companies navigate complex regulatory issues. Victoria's eyebrows rose in mock interest. "How quaint," she said, managing to make it sound like an insult. The evening was just beginning, and Victoria was already drawing blood. She had no idea that this Christmas Eve would be the last time she'd ever feel this powerful, this untouchable. Daniel's calm smile held secrets that would destroy everything she'd built, but for now, she was still the queen of her carefully constructed kingdom. The first attack was over, but the war was just beginning. Dinner was announced with the same fanfare that Victoria brought to everything else. She'd somehow convinced my mother to let her help with the seating arrangements, which meant that by the time we gathered around the extended dining table, I found myself relegated to the far end, squeezed between my 10-year-old nephew Tyler and the wall. It was the kind of subtle humiliation that Victoria specialized in, the type that looked accidental to anyone not paying close attention. Daniel was seated on the opposite side of the table, separated from me by strategically placed family members, and a large centerpiece that blocked our view of each other. Victoria had positioned herself in the seat that traditionally belonged to my father, claiming she needed to be centrally located to help coordinate the meal service. From her throne, she commanded a perfect view of the entire table, and could ensure that every conversation flowed through her. She'd also managed to surround herself with her chosen allies for the evening, cousin Miranda, who'd always been jealous of anyone who got attention, and Aunt Carol, who'd never forgiven my mother for being Dad's favorite sister. Together, they formed a triangle of judgment that would spend the next hour dissecting every aspect of my life. The gift exchange began before the main course was served, another Victoria innovation designed to maximize embarrassment. She made a show of distributing beautifully wrapped packages, each one carefully selected to highlight social hierarchies. Our parents received expensive wine from a vineyard she'd discovered during a recent business trip. Uncle Robert got tickets to a football game that cost more than most people's rent. Miranda received a designer handbag that she immediately modeled for the table. Even young Tyler got a video game that hadn't been released to the general public yet. When Victoria finally turned to me, her smile was radiant with false warmth. "Samantha," she announced, "I got you something special." She handed me a small bag from a local drugstore, the kind of generic gift bag that screamed afterthought. Inside was a set of bath products from the clearance section, the kind with generic scents and packaging that looked like it had been damaged in shipping. The contrast with everyone else's gifts was so stark that it felt intentional, which of course it was. "I thought you might enjoy some relaxation," Victoria said sweetly. "You always seem so stressed about money." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, watching Victoria with an expression I couldn't quite read. Miranda giggled nervously, while Aunt Carol made sympathetic noises that somehow made everything worse. My parents looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, their silence as damaging as Victoria's attack. Victoria wasn't finished with her performance. As dinner was served, she launched into a detailed discussion of her recent house purchase, a sprawling suburban mansion with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. She pulled out her phone and began showing photos to anyone within reach, describing each room with the enthusiasm of a real estate agent closing a deal. "The master bedroom is larger than most people's entire apartments," she said, looking directly at me. "Bradley and I really needed the space to entertain properly." The conversation naturally turned to housing, which meant more opportunities for Victoria to highlight my living situation. I rented a modest 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was up and coming, which in Victoria's translation meant dangerous and poor. She expressed concern about my safety, my building's maintenance issues, and my inability to build equity through homeownership. Each comment was delivered with sisterly concern that felt like tiny paper cuts. Daniel had been quiet throughout most of the dinner, responding politely when spoken to directly, but otherwise observing the family dynamics with the detachment of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. When Victoria finally turned her attention to him, asking pointed questions about his living situation and career prospects, he answered with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained all evening. But I noticed that he was asking his own questions, inquiring about Victoria's business, her client base, and her recent success stories with an interest that seemed almost professional. "Business has been incredible," Victoria boasted, refilling her wine glass for the 3rd time. "I've closed more deals this year than some agents close in their entire careers. The market is just responding to quality service and expertise." She went on to describe her expanding client roster, her plans to open a second office, and her recent partnerships with developers and investors. What struck me as odd was how specific Daniel's follow-up questions were, asking about regulatory compliance, licensing requirements, and oversight procedures, with the kind of knowledge that seemed unusual for someone who claimed to work in general business consulting. Victoria, however, was too intoxicated by her own success story to notice anything unusual about Daniel's inquiries. She answered his questions eagerly, clearly enjoying the opportunity to educate someone she considered intellectually inferior about the complexities of high-end real estate. She name-dropped clients, mentioned specific properties, and even bragged about some of the creative financing solutions she'd helped arrange for buyers who didn't quite qualify for traditional mortgages. Aunt Carol and Miranda hung on every word, asking follow-up questions that allowed Victoria to expand on her expertise. The conversation had completely shifted away from my shortcomings to Victoria's triumphs, which should have been a relief. Instead, I felt a growing sense of unease watching Daniel's face as Victoria talked. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something in his eyes that reminded me of a chess player who'd just realized his opponent had walked into a trap. As Victoria continued to hold court, describing her latest commission and the luxury vacation she and Brad were planning with the proceeds, Daniel quietly excused himself to use the restroom. When he returned a few minutes later, he was carrying a small notebook and wearing that same mysterious smile I'd noticed when he first arrived. Victoria was too busy describing her upcoming real estate awards ceremony to notice, but I had the strange feeling that the evening was about to take a turn that none of us were prepared for. The second course brought with it a renewed assault on my dignity, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Victoria had clearly spent considerable time planning this evening's entertainment, and I was the unwilling star of her show. Miranda and Aunt Carol had settled into their roles as supporting actresses, each taking turns to deliver carefully crafted observations about my life choices that somehow always circled back to my perceived failures. Miranda started with my career, expressing concern about the nonprofit sector's instability, and asking pointed questions about layoff rumors she'd heard from somewhere. Her delivery was masterful, disguised as genuine worry for my well-being while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about my professional competence. "I just think it's important to have backup plans," she said, her voice dripping with false compassion. "Especially in such uncertain times. You never know when organizations like that might have to make difficult decisions about staffing." Aunt Carol picked up the thread seamlessly, transitioning to questions about my financial planning and retirement savings. Had I considered the long-term implications of choosing passion over profit? Was I building any kind of financial security for my future? Her questions were delivered with the authority of someone who'd made all the right choices, even though everyone knew Uncle Robert's construction business had been struggling for years. But tonight wasn't about facts. It was about perception, and Victoria had crafted a narrative where I was the family charity case. The conversation about my relationship with Daniel was inevitable, and Victoria had been saving it for maximum impact. She began with seemingly innocent questions about our future plans, whether we'd discussed marriage, children, or buying property together. When I gave vague answers about taking things one day at a time, Victoria exchanged meaningful glances with her allies. "It's just that you've been together for what, 8 months now," she said, her tone suggesting that this was either too long, or not long enough. I would have thought serious conversations about the future would have started by now. Daniel had returned from his bathroom break carrying not just his notebook, but also his phone, which he'd placed on the table next to his plate. He seemed to be taking notes occasionally, though I couldn't see what he was writing. When Victoria asked him directly about his intentions regarding our relationship, his response was measured and diplomatic. He spoke about respecting the natural progression of relationships and not rushing important decisions, but Victoria wasn't satisfied with diplomacy. "The thing is," Victoria said, her voice taking on the tone she used when delivering particularly devastating news to clients, "Samantha has always been a bit naive about people's motivations. She tends to see the best in everyone, even when it's not in her best interest." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. She was suggesting that Daniel was taking advantage of my supposed gullibility, using me for financial support or social advancement. Miranda nodded knowingly, as if she'd been thinking the same thing. "It's sweet, really," she added. "Sam has always been so trusting. Remember in high school when she lent money to that boyfriend who never paid her back? The story wasn't true, but the details didn't matter. What mattered was creating a narrative of repeated poor judgment, a pattern of being used by men who didn't deserve my loyalty." Aunt Carol contributed her own fictional memories of my romantic failures, each story designed to paint me as someone who consistently chose partners who were beneath the family's standards. The three women had created an echo chamber of manufactured concern, their voices building to a crescendo of shared worry about my future. They spoke about me as if I wasn't sitting right there, as if my presence at the table was merely ornamental. Victoria announced that she'd been doing some research into Daniel's background, claiming it was her duty as my older sister to protect me from potential heartbreak. She'd looked up his LinkedIn profile, checked his company's website, and even driven past his apartment building to assess the neighborhood. Her investigation, she claimed, had raised some concerning questions about his financial stability and career prospects. "I'm not saying he's a bad person," Victoria said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when delivering bad news to clients. "I'm just saying that Samantha deserves someone who can provide the kind of security and stability that she's going to need, especially given her own career situation." The double blow was expertly delivered, attacking both Daniel's worthiness and my own perceived weakness in a single sentence. Daniel had been listening to this character assassination with remarkable composure, occasionally asking clarifying questions about Victoria's research methods or the sources of her information. His questions seemed innocent enough, but I noticed that they were forcing Victoria to be more specific about her claims. When she mentioned checking his company's financial records, Daniel asked how she'd obtained access to private business information. When she referenced his apartment building, he wondered aloud about the ethics of conducting surveillance on family members' romantic partners. Victoria brushed off his concerns with a laugh, claiming that successful business people always did their due diligence before making important decisions. "It's just smart business," she said, refilling her wine glass again. "You can't be too careful when family is involved." But Daniel's questions had introduced a note of discomfort into her previously confident performance. For the first time all evening, Victoria looked slightly unsure of herself. The photo session that followed was another calculated humiliation. Victoria announced that we needed to capture memories of this special Christmas Eve, and she began organizing family groupings with the skill of a professional photographer. She positioned herself at the center of each shot, surrounded by the family members she deemed most important. Parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles were carefully arranged to showcase Victoria's central role in family dynamics. I found myself consistently placed on the periphery of these compositions, squeezed into corners, or partially hidden behind other family members. Daniel was excluded entirely from several shots, with Victoria claiming that the photos were for family only, and that partners could be included in later, separate pictures that somehow never materialized. Each photo session reinforced the hierarchy that Victoria had spent years establishing, with me firmly positioned as the family afterthought. The evening was reaching a crescendo of manufactured drama, with Victoria clearly building toward some kind of grand finale. She kept glancing at her phone, checking the time with the anticipation of someone waiting for an important moment. Daniel had filled several pages in his notebook, his handwriting neat and precise, like someone documenting evidence for a future reference. The storm was gathering strength, and I had the unsettling feeling that we were all about to be caught in its path. The explosion I'd been dreading finally came during dessert, delivered with the same surgical precision that Victoria brought to everything else in her life. She stood up from her chair, wine glass in hand, and called for everyone's attention with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "I've been thinking," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver important news, "and I believe we need to have a serious family conversation about Samantha's future." The room fell silent except for the soft Christmas music playing in the background, and the distant sound of dishwashing from the kitchen, where my mother was cleaning up. Victoria had chosen her moment perfectly, waiting until everyone was relaxed and slightly buzzed from dinner wine, when resistance would be minimal and attention would be focused. She'd orchestrated this intervention with the same careful planning she brought to her real estate deals. "I love my sister," Victoria began, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a difficult, but necessary truth. "But love means being honest, even when it's uncomfortable. And honestly, I'm worried. I'm worried about her career prospects, her financial stability, and yes, I'm worried about her relationship choices." She gestured toward Daniel with her wine glass, not quite pointing, but making her target clear. Victoria painted a picture of my life that bore little resemblance to reality, but was delivered with such conviction that it began to take on the weight of truth. According to her narrative, I was struggling financially, borrowing money from our parents to make rent, and clinging to a dead-end job out of stubbornness rather than ambition. She claimed to have insider knowledge about upcoming layoffs at my organization, suggesting that I was living in denial about my professional prospects. The attack on Daniel was even more personal and specific. Victoria claimed to have done extensive research into his background, his company, and his financial situation. She suggested that he was using our relationship as a stepping stone, taking advantage of my naivety and the potential connections our family could provide. She painted him as an opportunist who was biding his time until something better came along, someone who was staying with me not out of love, but out of convenience. "I've seen this pattern before," Victoria said, her voice growing more passionate as she warmed to her theme. "Samantha has always been attracted to projects, to people she thinks she can fix or help. But relationships aren't charity cases, and love isn't about rescuing someone who's drowning." The metaphor was particularly cruel, because it suggested that Daniel was the one drowning, when in reality, I felt like I was the one struggling to keep my head above water in this toxic family dynamic. Miranda and Aunt Carol provided enthusiastic support for Victoria's intervention, sharing their own concerns and observations that aligned perfectly with the narrative being constructed. They spoke about whispered conversations they'd had with other family members, worried phone calls they'd exchanged about my well-being, and their shared concern that I was making decisions that would lead to long-term unhappiness. The most devastating part of Victoria's speech was how she weaponized our parents' love for me. She claimed that Mom and Dad were too kind-hearted to express their own concerns, but that she'd noticed their worry growing over the past months. She suggested that they'd been losing sleep over my choices, that they'd confided their fears to her as the older, more successful sibling. Whether any of this was true became irrelevant. Once the words were spoken, they took on a life of their own. Daniel had been listening to this character assassination with the same calm attention he'd shown all evening, but now he was taking more detailed notes. When Victoria paused for breath, he asked her a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Victoria, you mentioned doing research into my background. Can you tell me more about the methods you used to access private financial information?" His tone was conversational, almost casual, but there was something underneath it that made Victoria's confidence waver slightly. She brushed off his question with a laugh, claiming that successful business people knew how to gather information when necessary. "It's all public record," she said dismissively. "Anyone with the right connections can find out what they need to know." But Daniel's follow-up questions were more specific, asking about data protection laws, privacy regulations, and the legal implications of conducting unauthorized background checks on private individuals. Victoria's response revealed more than she probably intended. She began describing her network of contacts in banking, credit reporting, and local government, people who owed her favors from real estate deals, and who were willing to share information when she needed it. She spoke about these connections with pride, clearly viewing her ability to access private information as a sign of her professional success and personal power. Daniel was writing more quickly now, his pen moving across the page with purpose. When Victoria mentioned specific names and institutions, he asked for clarification, requesting details about how these information-gathering relationships worked and how often she used them for personal rather than professional purposes. His questions were leading Victoria to reveal the scope of her information network and the casual way she violated privacy boundaries. The conversation took another turn when Victoria began discussing my employment situation with suspicious specificity. She claimed to know details about my organization's financial health, upcoming budget cuts, and internal discussions about staff reductions. When Daniel asked how she'd obtained this information, Victoria initially claimed it came from public sources and industry contacts. But under continued questioning, a different picture emerged. Victoria revealed that she'd contacted my workplace directly, claiming to be a concerned family member who was worried about my emotional stability. She'd spoken with my supervisor under the pretense of offering family support, using the conversation to gather information about my job security and professional standing. She'd also reached out to colleagues in the nonprofit sector, spreading concerns about my mental health and professional competence under the guise of seeking advice. The room had grown very quiet as Victoria's methods became clear. What she'd initially presented as sisterly concern was revealing itself as something much more systematic and invasive. She'd been conducting a campaign to undermine my professional reputation, using her business connections and social network to gather ammunition for this evening's attack. Daniel closed his notebook and placed it carefully on the table next to his phone. For the first time all evening, his calm mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Victoria," he said, his voice still controlled but carrying a new edge, "I think there are some things about my background that you might find interesting. Things that your research probably didn't uncover." The smile that crossed his face wasn't entirely pleasant, and for the first time since dinner began, Victoria looked genuinely uncertain about what was coming next. Daniel's transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a skilled actor drop one character and assume another. The mild-mannered consultant who'd been politely enduring Victoria's attacks was gone, replaced by someone with a sharper edge and a confidence that filled the room. He reached for his phone and opened what appeared to be a professional app, his fingers moving with the familiarity of someone who used technology as a weapon rather than a tool. "Before we continue this conversation about due diligence and background research," Daniel said, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone at the table pay attention, "I think it might be helpful to clarify some misconceptions about my actual profession." He pulled up what appeared to be a legal document on his phone screen, though he kept it turned away from curious eyes. "You see, Victoria, while I do work as a consultant, I believe your research may have been somewhat incomplete." Victoria's confidence had been built on information asymmetry, on knowing things about other people that they didn't know she knew. But Daniel's questions about her research methods had revealed the scope of her intelligence gathering, and now the tables were turning in a way that clearly made her uncomfortable. She reached for her wine glass more frequently, her laughter became forced, and her responses to his questions grew more defensive. "I'm curious," Daniel continued, his tone conversational, but his intent clearly more serious, "about some of the business practices you've described tonight. The creative financing solutions you mentioned, for example. Can you tell me more about how those work?" His question seemed innocent enough, but Victoria's response revealed a detailed knowledge of mortgage manipulation, document modification, and regulatory workarounds that raised eyebrows around the table. Victoria began describing techniques for helping clients qualify for loans they couldn't traditionally afford, methods for inflating property values to justify larger mortgages, and strategies for structuring deals that minimized tax obligations through creative legal interpretations. She spoke with the pride of someone who considered herself an expert in navigating complex systems, but Daniel's follow-up questions revealed potential problems with each technique she described. "That's interesting," Daniel said when Victoria finished explaining how she'd helped a client secure a mortgage by restructuring their debt to temporarily improve their credit rating. "Are you familiar with the Dodd-Frank regulations regarding qualified mortgage standards? Or the recent CFPB guidelines on loan origination practices?" His questions were specific and technical, suggesting a level of expertise that went far beyond general business consulting. Victoria's discomfort was becoming visible to everyone at the table. She'd expected to spend the evening demonstrating her superior knowledge and professional success, but Daniel's questions were revealing gaps in her understanding of the legal framework surrounding her business practices. When she couldn't answer his regulatory questions, she attempted to dismiss them as irrelevant technicalities that didn't affect real-world business operations. "The thing about regulations," Victoria said with forced confidence, "is that they are written by people who've never actually worked in the field. Those of us who deal with real clients and real problems have to find practical solutions that work in the real world." Her response revealed a casual disregard for regulatory oversight that Daniel seemed to find particularly interesting, based on the detailed notes he was taking. The conversation shifted when Daniel began asking about Victoria's client relationships and business development strategies. She described techniques for cultivating referral networks, building relationships with mortgage brokers and financial planners, and developing partnerships with developers and investment groups. What emerged was a picture of a business model that relied heavily on reciprocal arrangements, favor trading, and relationship leverage that skirted the edges of professional ethics. Victoria spoke proudly about her ability to connect clients with friendly appraisers who would provide favorable property valuations, mortgage brokers who specialized in creative loan structures, and inspectors who understood the importance of maintaining business relationships. She described these connections as the mark of a sophisticated professional network, but Daniel's questions about disclosure requirements, conflict of interest policies, and fiduciary responsibilities suggested a different interpretation. "I'm particularly interested," Daniel said, his tone remaining conversational despite the increasingly serious nature of his questions, "in the investment partnerships you mentioned. Can you tell me more about how you structure those relationships with your clients?" Victoria's response revealed arrangements where she sometimes took equity positions in properties she was selling, received referral fees from related service providers, and maintained ongoing financial relationships with clients that extended well beyond the original transaction. The family members who had been enjoying Victoria's earlier performance were beginning to sense that something had shifted in the room's dynamic. Uncle Robert, who worked in construction and understood regulatory compliance issues, was paying closer attention to the technical aspects of Daniel's questions. Aunt Carol, who worked in banking, was beginning to look concerned about some of Victoria's business practices. Victoria's attempt to regain control of the conversation by redirecting attention to my failures was less successful this time. When she tried to resurrect concerns about my job security and relationship choices, Daniel simply asked how her unauthorized contact with my employer related to professional ethics and privacy law. When she claimed to be acting out of family concern, he wondered aloud about the difference between concern and interference, support and sabotage. "It's interesting," Daniel said, reviewing his notes with the air of someone organizing thoughts for a presentation, "how tonight's conversation has touched on so many different areas of professional practice. Real estate law, mortgage regulations, privacy legislation, professional ethics guidelines." He paused, looking directly at Victoria with an expression that was no longer entirely friendly. "You know, these are exactly the kinds of issues that come up in my actual area of specialization." Victoria had been growing more agitated as the conversation progressed, her earlier confidence eroding as Daniel's questions revealed the potential vulnerabilities in her business model. When she demanded to know what his area of specialization actually was, Daniel smiled with genuine warmth for the first time all evening. "Well," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve a business card, "I think it's time for proper introductions. You see, Victoria, while your background research was quite thorough in some areas, it seems to have missed some rather important details about what I actually do for a living." The business card he placed on the table was thick, expensive, and bore the letterhead of a law firm that even Victoria recognized. But it was the title under Daniel's name that made her face go white: Senior Partner, Financial Crimes Division. Suddenly, all of his questions about regulatory compliance, privacy violations, and business ethics took on a completely different meaning. Victoria had spent the evening confessing her crimes to a federal prosecutor, and the evidence was sitting in his notebook on the table between them. The silence that followed Daniel's revelation was profound, like the moment after lightning strikes, when everyone waits for the thunder. Victoria stared at the business card as if it were a snake that might bite her, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and growing horror. The elegant script on the expensive cardstock spelled out her worst nightmare: Daniel Morrison, Senior Partner, Federal Financial Crimes Division, Morrison, Webb and Associates. "I think there may have been some miscommunication about my background," Daniel said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to cross-examining hostile witnesses. You see, my firm specializes in exactly the kinds of business practices you've been describing tonight. Mortgage fraud, real estate manipulation, privacy violations, professional ethics breaches. It's been quite an educational evening, actually. Victoria's wine glass trembled in her hand as the implications of the evening's conversation began to dawn on her. Every boastful description of her business methods, every casual admission of regulatory shortcuts, every proud explanation of her networking strategies, had been delivered to someone whose job it was to prosecute exactly these types of crimes. Her attempt to destroy my reputation had become a detailed confession of her own criminal activity. Now, I want to be clear, Daniel continued, his tone becoming more formal. I'm not here tonight in any official capacity. This is Christmas Eve dinner with my girlfriend's family. But I have to say, the business practices you've described raise some serious concerns about compliance with federal banking regulations, real estate licensing requirements, and consumer protection laws. Miranda and Aunt Carol were backing away from Victoria both physically and conversationally, their earlier support evaporating as they began to understand that their alliance with her might have been a serious error in judgment. Uncle Robert was looking at his phone, probably Googling Daniel's law firm to confirm what we'd just learned. The family members who had been enjoying Victoria's performance were now dealing with the reality that they'd been witnessing something much more serious than holiday family drama. Victoria attempted to downplay her earlier statements, claiming that she'd been exaggerating for effect, or that Daniel had misunderstood her descriptions of standard industry practices. But Daniel had been taking detailed notes all evening, and his legal training had taught him to ask follow-up questions that locked witnesses into specific claims. When Victoria tried to walk back her description of document modification techniques, Daniel referred to his notes and quoted her exact words about helping clients adjust their financial pictures to tell a more compelling story. The evidence that Daniel began to present was devastating in its specificity. He pulled up files on his phone that detailed a federal investigation into fraudulent lending practices that had been ongoing for 18 months. Victoria's name appeared multiple times in the investigative documents, along with detailed descriptions of transactions that matched the deals she'd been bragging about earlier in the evening. The Patterson property sale, Daniel said, reading from his phone with the clinical tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence, involved a mortgage application that listed the buyer's income at $150,000, despite tax returns showing actual earnings of $78,000. The property appraisal came in at $425,000, though comparable sales suggested a market value closer to $360,000. The loan documents were processed through Meridian Financial, whose compliance officer happens to be your college roommate Sandra Webb. Victoria's face had gone from white to ashen gray as Daniel read the details of transactions that she thought were private business deals. The federal investigation had been gathering evidence on what prosecutors were calling a sophisticated mortgage fraud ring that involved multiple real estate agents, mortgage brokers, appraisers, and financial institutions. Victoria wasn't just a subject of interest. According to Daniel's files, she was considered a central figure in the conspiracy. The Morrison Family Trust property, Daniel continued, involved a particularly creative financing structure where the buyer's down payment was secretly provided by the seller through a shell company registered in Delaware. The mortgage broker received a $15,000 bonus for expediting the approval process without conducting standard verification procedures. The property was then immediately refinanced at an inflated value, with the proceeds used to fund similar transactions with other buyers. Each transaction Daniel described revealed a more sophisticated level of fraud than Victoria had admitted to during her earlier boasting. What she'd presented as clever business practices were actually federal crimes carrying potential sentences measured in years rather than months. The investigation had traced money flows, documented false statements, and identified a pattern of conspiracy that involved dozens of properties and millions of dollars in fraudulent loans. Victoria's attempts to interrupt Daniel's presentation became increasingly desperate. She claimed that all of her transactions had been properly documented and approved by licensed professionals. She insisted that she'd never knowingly violated any regulations, and that any irregularities were the result of errors or miscommunications by other parties. But Daniel's evidence included recorded phone conversations, email communications, and financial records that contradicted her claims. The interesting thing about financial crimes investigations, Daniel explained, his tone almost conversational despite the devastating nature of his revelations, is that they often start with one suspicious transaction and then expand as investigators follow the money trail. In your case, the investigation began when a mortgage processor noticed a pattern of unusual loan applications coming through the same referral network. One investigation led to another, and now we're looking at a conspiracy that spans multiple states and involves millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The family members who had been enjoying Victoria's earlier dominance were now grappling with the reality that their successful, confident relative was actually a criminal who had been using family gatherings to boast about her illegal activities. The Christmas Eve celebration had transformed into something that felt more like a police interrogation, with Daniel methodically dismantling Victoria's carefully constructed facade of legitimate success. Victoria's final attempt to regain control involved attacking Daniel's presence at the family gathering, claiming that he'd deceived us all by not revealing his true profession, and suggesting that his relationship with me was actually an undercover investigation. But Daniel's response was swift and devastating. "Victoria, I met Samantha at a charity fundraiser 8 months ago, long before your name appeared in any federal database. The fact that my girlfriend's sister turned out to be the subject of a criminal investigation is an unfortunate coincidence, not a professional conspiracy." The weight of Daniel's evidence was crushing Victoria's spirit as well as her confidence. Her business empire, her professional reputation, and her carefully cultivated image of success were crumbling in real time as the family watched. The woman who had spent the evening attacking my life choices was learning that her own choices had placed her in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. The golden child was about to become the family's greatest source of shame, and everyone in the room was beginning to understand that this Christmas Eve would be remembered as the night everything changed. The full scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise emerged as Daniel continued to present evidence that painted a picture far more devastating than anyone had imagined. What had initially appeared to be aggressive, but legal business practices, was revealed to be a sophisticated financial fraud operation that had been operating for over 3 years. Victoria hadn't just been bending rules, she'd been running what federal investigators were calling a major racketeering scheme. The Celestial Investments case is particularly interesting, Daniel said, pulling up another file that made Victoria visibly flinch. This involved a property development scheme where investors were promised returns based on projected property values that were entirely fictional. The development permits had never been approved, the environmental impact studies were fabricated, and the financial projections were based on comparable sales in completely different markets. Victoria had convinced over 40 investors to put money into a luxury housing development that existed only on paper. She'd used her real estate license and professional reputation to lend credibility to completely fraudulent investment opportunities. The investors, many of whom were elderly clients who trusted her expertise, had lost their retirement savings to fund Victoria's lifestyle and to bankroll other fraudulent schemes. The money trail is quite sophisticated, Daniel continued, his tone taking on the analytical quality of someone who'd spent months studying financial records. Funds from the Celestial Investments scheme were used to make down payments on properties in the Patterson development, which generated commissions that were then used to pay false returns to earlier investors in other schemes. It's a classic Ponzi structure, but implemented through real estate transactions to make it look legitimate. The implications of Victoria's actions were becoming clear to everyone at the table. She hadn't just been committing isolated crimes. She'd been running an interconnected network of fraud that had victimized dozens of families. The elderly couple she'd helped creatively finance their dream home had actually been sold a property at an inflated price with a mortgage they could never afford. The first-time home buyers she'd helped were now facing foreclosure because their loans had been based on falsified income documentation. Victoria's attempts to minimize her role in these schemes were pathetic and desperate. She claimed that she'd been following instructions from mortgage brokers and developers, that she'd trusted other professionals to handle the legal aspects of transactions, and that she'd been as surprised as anyone when problems emerged. But Daniel's evidence included email communications where Victoria had explicitly discussed strategies for circumventing regulations and hiding the true nature of transactions from oversight authorities. This email from March 15, Daniel read, his voice carrying the weight of damning evidence, contains your instructions to an appraiser about finding creative ways to justify higher valuations without triggering automatic reviews. You specifically mention the importance of staying below certain threshold amounts that would require additional oversight. Victoria had not only been aware of regulatory requirements, she'd been actively strategizing about how to avoid them. The personal cost of Victoria's crimes was becoming apparent beyond the legal implications. Daniel revealed that her husband Brad had filed for divorce 3 weeks earlier, after learning about the federal investigation from their family attorney. Brad's name appeared on several property transactions and business documents, and his legal team was working to demonstrate that he'd been an unwitting participant in his wife's criminal schemes. The family home is currently under asset forfeiture proceedings, Daniel explained, his tone becoming almost gentle as he delivered news that would devastate any normal person. The 3-car garage, the swimming pool, the master bedroom that's larger than most people's apartments. All of it was purchased with proceeds from fraudulent transactions. The federal government considers it to be criminal assets subject to seizure. Victoria's carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. The house she'd bragged about was being taken by the government. The husband she'd assumed would always support her had abandoned her. The business empire she'd built through crime was being dismantled by federal investigators. Even her real estate license had been suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The family members who had been enjoying Victoria's earlier performance were now grappling with their own potential exposure. Miranda and Aunt Carol had both invested money with Victoria in what they'd believed were legitimate real estate ventures. Uncle Robert had used Victoria's services to purchase an investment property that was now under investigation for appraisal fraud. The successful, confident woman they'd been supporting was actually a criminal who had victimized her own family. The indictments are expected to be unsealed within the next 2 weeks, Daniel said, closing the files on his phone with the finality of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. The prosecutors have been building their case methodically, waiting to gather evidence on the full scope of the conspiracy before making arrests. Your cooperation tonight has been quite helpful in filling in some of the details they were missing. Victoria's breakdown was complete and devastating. The confident, successful woman who had spent the evening attacking my life choices was revealed to be a fraud and a criminal whose entire existence had been built on lies and theft. Her professional success was criminal enterprise, her financial security was stolen money, and her family relationships were based on deception and manipulation. The irony of the evening's events was not lost on anyone present. Victoria had orchestrated this Christmas Eve gathering to demonstrate her superiority and to humiliate me in front of the family. Instead, she had confessed to federal crimes in front of a prosecutor, provided evidence that would strengthen the case against her, and revealed the extent of her criminal activities to people who had previously supported and admired her. Daniel's final revelation was perhaps the most devastating of all. "The interesting thing about financial fraud investigations," he said, his voice carrying a note of professional satisfaction, "is that they often reveal patterns of behavior that extend beyond business activities. The same willingness to deceive and manipulate that drives financial crimes also tends to manifest in personal relationships." He'd been investigating more than just Victoria's business practices. The systematic way she'd undermined my reputation, the privacy violations she'd committed in researching Daniel's background, and the manipulation tactics she'd used throughout the evening were all evidence of a personality disorder that manifested in criminal behavior across all areas of her life. Victoria wasn't just a white-collar criminal. She was a sociopath who had been destroying lives both professionally and personally for years. The woman who had started the evening as the family's golden child was ending it as their greatest source of shame and legal liability. The Christmas Eve that was supposed to showcase her triumph had become the night of her complete and total destruction. And the sister she'd tried to humiliate was the only family member who hadn't been victimized by her crimes. The aftermath of Daniel's revelations created a void in the room that seemed to swallow sound, light, and breath itself. Victoria sat in her chair like a deflated balloon, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into something raw and desperate. The family members who had spent years enabling her behavior were forced to confront their own complicity in creating and maintaining the monster that had been living among them. My parents, who had perfected the art of willful blindness when it came to Victoria's treatment of me, were the first to break the silence. Mom's voice was barely above a whisper when she asked Daniel if he was certain about the evidence, if there might be some mistake or misunderstanding that could explain away what we'd just learned. The hope in her voice was heartbreaking, the desperate wish of a mother trying to protect a child who had long since moved beyond protection. Dad's reaction was different, more anger than sorrow. "We knew something was wrong," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed doubts. The expensive gifts, the lavish lifestyle, the sudden success that didn't quite add up with market conditions. We told ourselves we were being paranoid, that we should be proud of Victoria's achievements instead of questioning them. His confession revealed that my parents had suspected something was amiss, but had chosen to ignore their instincts rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The conversation that followed was painful and necessary, a reckoning that had been years in the making. Uncle Robert revealed that he'd always felt uneasy about the investment property transaction that Victoria had arranged for him, particularly the unusually favorable financing terms and the appraisal that seemed too good to be true. Aunt Carol admitted that she'd had concerns about Victoria's treatment of me, but had justified her silence by assuming that successful people operated by different rules. Miranda's confession was perhaps the most revealing about the family dynamics that had enabled Victoria's behavior. She admitted that she'd never particularly liked Victoria, but had aligned with her because Victoria's success reflected well on the entire family. Supporting Victoria's attacks on me had been a way of maintaining her own position in the family hierarchy, even though she'd often felt guilty about participating in what she knew was cruel behavior. "The thing is," Miranda said, her voice shaking with emotion, "we all knew Victoria was mean. We knew she was manipulative and controlling, and that she treated Sam terribly. But she was also successful, and we told ourselves that success justified everything else. We thought that if she was winning, then somehow we were all winning by association." The family's enablement of Victoria's abusive behavior toward me was laid bare in the conversation that followed. They had watched her systematically undermine my confidence, sabotage my relationships, and attack my life choices at every family gathering for years. They had justified their silence by convincing themselves that Victoria's criticism was tough love, that her attacks were designed to motivate me to achieve more. Grandma Helen, who had remained silent throughout the evening's revelations, finally spoke with the authority that comes with age and perspective. "We failed, Samantha," she said simply, her words carrying more weight than any lengthy apology could have managed. "We allowed Victoria to abuse her sister in our presence, at our table, in our home. We enabled it, because it was easier than confronting it, and because Victoria's success made us feel good about ourselves." The conversation turned to the specific ways that family members had participated in, or ignored Victoria's campaign against me. They remembered Christmas gatherings where Victoria had publicly humiliated me while everyone else found reasons to look away. They recalled family vacations where Victoria had systematically excluded me from activities and conversations, while others made excuses for her behavior. They acknowledged birthday parties and holidays where Victoria had used family gatherings as opportunities to demonstrate her superiority over me. Daniel had remained largely silent during this family reckoning, understanding that this was a conversation that needed to happen without outside interference. But when my father asked him directly about the legal implications for family members who had been victimized by Victoria's investment schemes, Daniel's response was both professional and compassionate. "The investigators understand that family members are often the primary victims in financial fraud cases," he explained. "Victoria used your trust and affection to legitimize her criminal activities. The fact that she victimized her own family actually strengthens the prosecution's case by demonstrating the breadth and callousness of her criminal behavior." The practical implications of Victoria's arrest were beginning to dawn on everyone. Uncle Robert's investment property would likely be seized as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings. Miranda and Aunt Carol's investments with Victoria were probably lost forever. The family members who had served as character references for Victoria's business might face scrutiny from investigators trying to understand how she'd maintained her criminal enterprise for so long. Victoria herself had remained largely silent during this family discussion, occasionally attempting to interrupt with justifications or denials that were immediately shot down by Daniel's evidence or by family members who were no longer willing to enable her delusions. When she tried to claim that she'd been trying to help her investors make money, Daniel read from emails where she'd discussed the importance of managing expectations and controlling information flow to prevent investors from understanding the true nature of their investments. Her final attempt to regain sympathy involved attacking my character again, claiming that I'd always been jealous of her success, and that I'd somehow orchestrated the evening's events to destroy her. But the family members, who had spent years watching her abuse me, were no longer willing to accept that narrative. They had seen too much evidence of her capacity for manipulation and destruction to believe that I was capable of the sophisticated criminal conspiracy that had actually destroyed her. The evening was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's phone ringing, a call that he answered with the formal tone he used for professional business. The conversation was brief and largely one-sided, consisting mostly of Daniel providing confirmation of details and agreeing to meet with someone the following day. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "That was the lead prosecutor on the case," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone delivering official information. "There's been a development in the investigation that requires immediate attention. Victoria, I need to inform you that a federal arrest warrant was issued this afternoon. The agents were planning to execute it tomorrow morning, but given tonight's conversation, they are concerned about flight risk." The sound of cars pulling into the driveway outside interrupted whatever response Victoria might have made. Through the front window, we could see the unmistakable silhouettes of law enforcement vehicles, their headlights cutting through the Christmas Eve darkness. Victoria's Christmas had just become the night of her arrest, and the family gathering that was supposed to showcase her triumph had become the setting for her downfall. Daniel stood up from the table and straightened his tie, transforming once again from boyfriend to prosecutor. "Victoria Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the formal authority of federal law enforcement, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda rights that followed were delivered in the same dining room where Victoria had spent the evening confessing her crimes, surrounded by the family members she'd spent years abusing and manipulating. As federal agents entered our parents' house and placed handcuffs on Victoria in front of the Christmas tree, the final chapter of her reign of terror was being written. The golden child who had terrorized me for years was being led away in custody, her carefully constructed life in ruins, her criminal enterprise dismantled, and her family finally aware of the monster they had enabled and protected. Christmas Eve had indeed brought revelations, but they were revelations that would destroy Victoria's world while setting me free from years of abuse and manipulation. 6 months later, I sat in the same living room where Victoria's world had imploded, but everything about the space felt different. The Christmas decorations had long since been packed away, replaced by the warm light of late June sunshine streaming through windows that no longer felt like prison bars. The house itself seemed lighter somehow, as if Victoria's arrest had lifted a dark cloud that had been hovering over our family for years. Victoria was serving a federal sentence of 8 years in minimum security prison, her plea bargain having reduced what could have been a 20-year sentence in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into mortgage fraud networks. The woman who had once commanded every room she entered was now wearing a prison uniform and sharing a cell with another white-collar criminal. The house she'd bragged about had been seized and sold, the proceeds distributed to victims of her various schemes. Brad had moved forward with their divorce and remarried within 4 months of Victoria's sentencing, choosing a quiet ceremony that was notably not attended by any members of the Hayes family. His new wife was a kindergarten teacher, who drove a modest sedan and lived in a small apartment, the antithesis of everything Victoria had represented. Their happiness seemed genuine and uncomplicated, built on honesty rather than fraud, love rather than manipulation. The transformation in my own life had been equally dramatic, but infinitely more positive. The nonprofit organization where I worked had promoted me to regional coordinator after my successful management of a complex community development project. The job came with increased responsibility, better pay, and most importantly, recognition for the value of my work. The financial struggles that Victoria had used to humiliate me were becoming a thing of the past, but more importantly, I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by my salary or my sister's approval. Daniel and I had grown closer through the trauma of that Christmas Eve. Our relationship deepened by his protection of me during Victoria's final assault, and by our shared navigation of the legal aftermath. He'd handled the ethical complexities of the situation with remarkable professionalism, recusing himself from the prosecution team to avoid conflicts of interest, while still providing emotional support to me throughout the investigation and trial. The family dynamics had undergone a complete revolution in Victoria's absence. My parents had started attending therapy together, working to understand how they'd enabled Victoria's abusive behavior and learning new patterns of communication that didn't revolve around avoiding conflict. They'd apologized repeatedly for their years of silence during Victoria's attacks, acknowledging that their desire to maintain peace had actually enabled war. Uncle Robert had lost his investment property to the asset forfeiture proceedings, but he'd also gained something more valuable. An understanding of how his silence had contributed to my suffering. He'd become one of my strongest supporters within the family, often checking in to make sure I felt heard and valued at family gatherings. His construction business had actually improved after severing ties with Victoria's referral network, as he'd been forced to develop more ethical business relationships. Miranda and Aunt Carol had both lost money in Victoria's investment schemes, but they'd also lost something more important: their illusions about the nature of success and power. They'd begun treating me with genuine respect rather than the condescending pity they'd previously shown, and they'd become advocates for addressing toxic family dynamics rather than enablers of them. The extended family gatherings that had once been battlegrounds for Victoria's ego were now genuine celebrations of connection and love. Without Victoria's dominating presence, other family members had space to express themselves, to share their own achievements and struggles, to participate in conversations rather than simply serve as audiences for Victoria's performances. Grandma Helen, now 84 years old, had become one of my closest allies and fiercest protectors. She'd confided that she'd always seen through Victoria's manipulation, but had felt powerless to intervene effectively. Now, she served as a family historian, helping everyone understand how patterns of abuse and enablement had developed over generations, and how they could be broken moving forward. The most profound change was in my own relationship with myself. For years, I'd internalized Victoria's attacks, believing that perhaps I really was less successful, less attractive, less worthy than my accomplished sister. The revelation of her criminal behavior had forced me to reevaluate everything I'd believed about success, achievement, and self-worth. I'd learned that Victoria's apparent success had been built on lies and theft, but more importantly, I'd learned that her opinion of me had never been based on my actual qualities or achievements. Daniel had proposed on Christmas Eve of the following year, exactly 1 year after Victoria's arrest. He'd chosen the same house, the same room, even the same time of evening, transforming what had been the site of trauma into the setting for celebration. His proposal speech had referenced the strength I'd shown during the crisis, the grace with which I'd handled Victoria's abuse, and the resilience I'd demonstrated in rebuilding relationships with family members who had failed to protect me. The engagement ring he'd chosen was modest, but beautiful, selected for its meaning rather than its ability to impress. We'd planned a small wedding with close friends and family members who truly supported our relationship, deliberately avoiding the kind of lavish display that Victoria had always demanded. Our celebration would be about love and commitment rather than performance and status. The legal proceedings had finally concluded with restitution orders that would ensure Victoria's victims received compensation for their losses, though the emotional damage she'd inflicted would take much longer to heal. Several elderly investors had lost their life savings to her schemes, and while they would eventually recover their money, the betrayal of trust would leave permanent scars. The lessons learned from Victoria's downfall extended far beyond our family. The mortgage fraud network she'd participated in had been completely dismantled, leading to new regulations and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar schemes. Her case had become a teaching example in law schools and business ethics courses, illustrating how personal character flaws could manifest in professional criminal behavior. As I sat in that transformed living room, reflecting on the journey from victimization to empowerment, I realized that Victoria's attempt to destroy me had actually been the catalyst for my liberation. Her Christmas Eve assault had finally forced the family to confront dynamics that had been poisoning our relationships for years. Her arrest had eliminated the source of toxicity that had been undermining my confidence and self-worth. The woman who had tried to convince everyone that I was a failure had proven herself to be the actual failure, not just professionally, but morally, ethically, and fundamentally as a human being. The sister who had spent years attacking my life choices had made choices that destroyed her own life and victimized countless others. The family member who had positioned herself as superior to me had revealed herself to be inferior in every way that actually mattered. Sometimes the people who try hardest to destroy you are actually destroying themselves, and the cruelty they inflict on others is really a reflection of the emptiness and corruption in their own souls. Victoria's attacks on me had been projections of her own insecurities and guilt, desperate attempts to distract attention from her own criminal behavior by focusing criticism on imaginary flaws in my character. True family supports each other's growth and celebrates each other's successes rather than competing for dominance and status. Real love protects without conditions, stands up to bullies without hesitation, and chooses honesty over comfort even when the truth is difficult to face. The family I'd built with Daniel and the relationships I'd rebuilt with reformed family members were based on these healthier foundations. The final lesson of that Christmas Eve was that justice doesn't always arrive when we expect it, but it does eventually arrive for those who persist in living with integrity and treating others with dignity. Victoria's crimes had been years in the making, and their exposure had seemed impossible until the moment it became inevitable. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, especially when spoken by people who refuse to be silenced by bullies and manipulators. What do you think would have happened if Daniel hadn't been there that night? Have you ever dealt with a toxic family member who seemed untouchable until they finally faced consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Don't forget to share this with anyone who might need to hear that toxic people eventually face the consequences of their actions, even when it takes longer than we'd like. Thank you for watching, and remember that sometimes the best Christmas present is the truth, even when it comes wrapped in handcuffs. Wishing you all the courage to stand up to the bullies in your own life, and the wisdom to recognize that real success is built on integrity, not deception.